All right, so Marianne Williamson and Dr. Jordan B. Peterson recently got into a little bit of a fight over on Twitter.com where they were arguing over whether or not climate change is something that is not to be concerned about or whether it's something that we should try to engage in some sort of a mass civilization-wide mobilization in order to tackle it as an issue. So I'm going to run you through exactly what their beef was here, and then remind you guys of some of the most questionable takes that we have gotten from Jordan Peterson in regards to this issue of climate change in the past. So here to start us off, it seems like this is where the beef essentially came forward. So obviously Marianne Williamson is running for president in 2024. I happen to be in support of her candidacy. I'm trying to set up an interview with her. That'll probably be posted on the channel in the next couple of weeks, so looking forward to that. But she basically posted this compilation here where she says we need a World War II level mass mobilization to address climate change on a fundamental level, which is, in my opinion, 100% true. I covered on this channel just a couple of weeks ago the most recent IPCC report on where we are at right now. You know, hint, we are nowhere close to being where we need to be in order to avoid some of the most disastrous consequences from climate change. And so yes, we do need a mass mobilization. We need to take the issue seriously. We need to treat it as the threat that it is, and we need to use the resources that we have here in the United States and around the world in order to tackle this issue, to phase out fossil fuel usage, and to move towards a more sustainable economy and a more sustainable energy system. So that's essentially the argument she's laying out here. Let's just watch a little bit of this video, and then we'll get to where Jordan Peterson took issue with it. So here's Marianne.
Climate change is the greatest moral challenge of our generation.
Do we need a Green New Deal? Oh, you betcha we need a Green New Deal. But we need a Green New Century.
We need to do more than mitigate the effects of climate change. We need to recognize it as the existential threat to the species that it actually is. There's a reason why we are not adequately dealing with the climate crisis, and that is because of the obstruction from fossil fuel companies. We need to sequester the carbon. We need the reforestation processes. We need to develop sustainable energy, sustainable transportation, and we need to deal with animal factory farming as well. We would have, if I were president of the United States, a world-class environmentalist at the head of the EPA.
We have to recognize the destruction of our environment as an ongoing process, as the greatest moral challenge of our generation, to not just stop it, but to actually reverse climate change, to actually create what you think that just because a Democrat wins, that the fossil fuel company is going to go, oh, okay. It's not going to be enough to have a Democratic president. We need more than that. We need to be awake, because that president, whoever is going to take that same stuff and those same obstructions, it's got to be all of us who are so awake. And not only do you have to wake up in order to elect a Democrat, not only do you have to really wake up to elect me, you have to wake up and stay awake. We need to see the mobilization for the protection and the repair of our ecosystem as important, as significant, and as massive a mobilization as was World War II.
Okay, so she's 100% correct. Honestly, looking through that clip, it doesn't seem like there's anything that I would really take any serious issue with. I mean, she even went so far as to, point out the fact that just because you have a Democrat who happens to be in power, that doesn't mean you are seriously enough addressing this issue of climate change. I just covered on this channel a couple weeks ago the Joe Biden administration approving the Willow Project, for example, completely betraying his promise on the campaign trail to not allow any new oil and gas leasing on federal lands. He just put up the entire fucking Gulf of Mexico for sale to private, for-profit, multinational, billion-dollar fossil fuel corporations. He's allowed guys like Joe Manchin, okay, a fellow Democrat from West Virginia who, oh, by the way, literally owns a coal company within West Virginia, to dictate much of his climate policy and this so-called historic investment in climate change. Okay, so that's who Joe Biden is. Just because you have a Democrat who's in power does not mean that we've somehow passed the Green New Deal or that we are being too radical with our approach to climate change. If anything, it's the exact opposite of that. We are not doing enough on that front. Okay, so that's the reality of the situation, and credit to Marianne Williamson for being able to recognize that for what it is. So what is the issue that Jordan B. Peterson has with this? Well, here was his initial response. He says, "Your Democrat candidates in action. Everything is in apocalyptic crisis. Give us all the power now. Nothing suspicious about that." Okay, hold on. Let's just take a pause real quick. Let's try to give a real analysis of what Marianne Williamson just said. We all just saw the video, right? Was she calling to give us all of the power now? What? Where did that even come from? No, she was saying we need to mobilize, as if this is an issue of like war, similar to World War II, meaning it is of that scale. If anything, it could even be argued that it's an even greater scale than World War II in terms of an existential threat to global civilization as we know it today. That was the point that she was making. She wasn't saying, make me dictator for life, and I'm going to take away all of your big, gas guzzling trucks tomorrow, and then that'll solve the issue or something. Nobody was saying anything about give us all the power. If anything, she was giving a critique about the entrenched power that the fossil fuel industry has over our political system and over our political pundits like Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, okay, pointing out that that's where the entrenched power is right now and how that is preventing us from actually addressing the issue, okay? That's where the real power lies. It's in the fossil fuel industry. It is in the hands of the politicians who are bought and controlled and invested in the fossil fuel industry. That's where the power is. They have already accumulated the power in their hands. She's saying we need to restore it to the American people and democratically decide how we can progress forward in order to tackle this issue collectively. That's what she was saying. Somehow he interprets that as give me all the power now. I need all of this power for myself as an individual. Nothing suspicious about that, right? But also ahead of that, he says, oh, this is classic Democrats over here. Everything is an apocalyptic crisis. Everything is an apocalyptic crisis. First of all, if there was any issue on the face of the planet, maybe outside of like the prospects of nuclear war in the immediate future, climate change is one of those issues where you could, in good faith, describe it as being semi-apocalyptic, okay? That's like one of the very few issues where you're not being hyperbolic by describing it as a potentially hyperbolic or a potentially apocalyptic kind of a situation. So first of all, that's that aspect of it. But also, this is coming from a guy, okay, who also represents the Daily Wire, right? That's where his new show is on, right? He comes from the Daily Wire, full of a cast of complete deranged psychopaths like Matt Walsh and Michael Knowles and Ben Shapiro and Peterson himself, who are currently trying to wage a war against the LGBTQ community and trying to convince the American people that trans people are a literal existential threat to Western civilization, okay? That's what they think is a threat, an apocalyptic threat to the current world order, is trans people existing and being accepted within society, okay? So that's an apocalyptic threat, trans people, but climate change is somehow not an apocalyptic threat. Okay, so that's Jordan B. Peterson's analysis on this. Now, we get to this. We had a response here from Marianne Williamson. She said, you've inverted the conspiracy. Big oil has all the power and wants to keep it. 100% correct. She links to this piece here. They say Jordan Peterson's climate expert is science denier funded by oil-backed think tank. The Canadian author has cited S. Fred Singer, an American physicist who argued climate change was natural after telling the podcast host Joe Rogan that climate change could not be modeled accurately. And we're going to get to that clip here of Jordan Peterson basically saying climate change is everything, climate change can't possibly be defined or even attempted to be addressed in a meaningful capacity. But this is who Jordan Peterson is, one of the main people who he has cited in his anti-climate change arguments, okay, is a straight up oil-backed think tank funded person, okay? That's who we're talking about here. And the point that she makes up here is super important, okay? You've inverted the conspiracy. This is something that pisses me off. It frustrates me to the end of time with how conservatives address not only climate change, but every single issue, okay? Let's just think about the Ohio train derailment, right? Obviously, I covered that a bunch on this channel when it was occurring, and the aftermath of that, the responses to that, all of the debates surrounding that. It's a perfect case study example, okay? This is what conservatives do. As she points out there, they invert the conspiracy to try to confuse people to further the perpetuance of the status quo, to further the power, the entrenched authority that private capitalists have in our political and economic system. Okay, so what am I talking about? With the Ohio train derailment, for example, we know exactly what caused that derailment, okay? It was a lack of regulation, specifically a lack of regulation due to the undue influence of these private monopolistic rail corporations that they have over our politicians, okay? That's what resulted in this. You had the deregulation under the Trump administration. You had the lack of regulation under the Obama administration. You still have a lack of regulation from the Biden administration, okay? That's what led to the increased likelihood that those kinds of derailments would actually take place, okay? It's a problem with capitalism. It's a problem with not having a nationalized rail industry. It's a problem with allowing these monopolistic corporations to slash their workforces, to increase the risk and the safety, or decrease the safety standards within our rail networks that led to this, okay? It is them lobbying our politicians in order to be able to get away with that. So that's a problem with political corruption and with capitalism. Now, how did conservatives respond to the Ohio train derailment? You had all of them running around and saying, this is some sort of a conspiracy. This is the government doing this, okay? This is the government out to get you. They intentionally poisoned this community, okay? To the extent that the government is responsible for, you know, a lack of oversight or a lack of involvement in a good faith way in addressing the aftermath of that, that is due to, again, the undue influence of those corporations on our political system, okay? But beyond that, again, you could largely blame the corporations in and of themselves, BNSF, the Norfolk Southern Company as well, okay? That's who you would be blaming if you were an honest actor and giving a real analysis of this situation. But instead, they try to create these conspiracies and say, oh, this is actually the government that's out to get you, which, and you know, an implication of that, a natural implication of their argument is to say we need less government involvement in these industries. We need to exacerbate the underlying problems by deregulating these industries, by removing the government entirely from the picture, and thereby removing the democratic ability for the American people to be a check on these industries, okay? It's a complete inversion of the conspiracy. The conspiracy is very simple. The conspiracy is out in the open, regardless of whatever industry you want to talk about, whether it's the rail industry, whether it's the fossil fuel industry, whether it's the pharmaceutical industry, whatever industry you want to talk about. The problem is corruption. The problem is capitalists corrupting our political system. That's it. But instead, they decide to pin it on the exact opposite of that. So she's 100% correct. We had this pointed out also by friend of the show, Kyle Kalinsky. He says, Jordan Peterson apparently sees no issue with these things, but is terrified if people want to fix it. Okay, again, inverting the conspiracy. He's saying the conspiracy is actually anybody within the government or activists on the outside who want to address climate change in a meaningful capacity. That's the real threat, not this threat. Okay, so he links a couple of different articles here. The Middle East is becoming literally uninhabitable. Seems kind of bad, if you ask me. Here from the BBC, how water shortages are brewing wars. Okay, this is something we heard straight from Kamala Harris. She said over the next couple of decades, we are probably going to see wars over water as climate change continues to exacerbate that as an issue, and imperialist countries like the United States and the rest of Western Europe and other countries as well that are wealthy tend to dominate a lot of these countries that have more access to water sources, and we are going to potentially use our economic, our political, our military power in order to try to exploit their resources and potentially even start wars over these resources as they continue to diminish. Here from the Los Angeles Times, the Colorado River is drying up. Climate change and drought have taken a major toll. One last one here from Forbes. Heat waves driven by climate change have cost the world $16 trillion since the 90s. Okay, so this is, another great point to be making here, which is that you cannot even make an economic argument in terms of not addressing climate change, in terms of not shifting away from fossil fuels as aggressively as possible and towards renewable energy. You can't make that argument because the destructive financial consequences from not addressing climate change in a meaningful capacity are going to far outweigh any potential economic consequences from shifting away from fossil fuel usage, okay? It's not only going to save us money in the long term, but it will potentially allow the United States, for example, if we wanted to aggressively shift towards renewable energy, to be leading the world in that emerging industry. Okay, so you can't even make an economic argument about it, but good point there from Secular Talk's Kyle Kalinsky. On top of that, we had a Jordan Peterson response again to basically Marianne Williamson's insinuation there. So this is where he left it off. He says, and this is just absolutely amazing, the amount that Jordan Peterson cannot understand the inner workings of how the Democratic Party, the establishment versus the grassroots, actually functions. He says here, apparently the Democrats, and for some reason links like every single person who is a Democratic establishment or a Democratic political apparatus here, entity. He says apparently the Democrats, okay, and he adds Senate Democrats, House Democrats, the Democrats are capable of fielding worse candidates than Kamala Harris. Okay, I agree. Kamala Harris is an absolutely atrocious candidate, but she's not Marianne Williamson. They have a lot of disagreements, believe it or not. And Gavin Newsom, and that's quite an anti-miracle. Okay, so basically, the insinuation here from Jordan Peterson is that what? The Democratic Party is fielding Marianne Williamson. That's the insinuation, really. That's the argument that you're putting forward. The Democratic establishment, okay, whether it's Senate Democrats, whether it's Chuck Schumer leading the Senate Democrats, whether it's House Democrats with Nancy Pelosi, she's retired now, passed off the torch, right? But any of these establishment Democrats within the Senate, within the House, within the upper echelons of the Democratic Party, Joe Biden himself, Kamala Harris herself, they absolutely despise Marianne Williamson. Okay, the corporate media that tends to be the cheerleaders for the Democratic Party, MSNBC, CNN, they are barely even giving Marianne Williamson a single inch of airtime. Okay, they are not treating her seriously. They are smearing her on a regular basis. They do not like Marianne Williamson. Not only did they not field her as a candidate, but they are doing everything in their power in order to prevent the American people from taking her seriously as a potential option. Okay, she is the outsider in this situation. She's not part of the Democratic establishment, okay? But that's his read on the situation. So it gives you an insight in terms of how little he actually understands about how the Democratic Party works. And this goes for all of his other pundits as well. Ben Shapiro, Steven Crowder, Michael Knowles, Matt Walsh, they clump together everybody from Hillary Clinton to AOC to like actual members of, socialist organizations on the ground. They group those all together as if they're the same thing, okay? Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden have more in common with Donald Trump than they do with somebody like me, an actual socialist, okay? There's this rapid, massive divide between the actual base of people who tend to support the Democratic Party, but the base of people who are trying to actually address climate change and the Democratic establishment. Those are completely different entities here who do not share the same values. They do not share the same set of policy goals that they want to see implemented, especially on this issue of climate change. Again, look at Joe Biden's track record. He's approved more oil and gas leases on American soil than even Donald Trump did. Okay, that's who Joe Biden is. That's not Marianne Williamson. Not the same thing in any way, shape, or form, but that's his analysis here. And so that's basically the beef in as summarized ways I could possibly give it. But just as a reminder here, not only is he citing people, as Marianne was pointing out there at the beginning of this video, not only is he citing people who are directly backed by the oil and gas lobby here in the United States, but we also just get atrocious takes like this. Okay, this one was absolutely hilarious. Just from a couple of months ago, back in January, he posted this this graphic here, or quote tweeted this graphic, and he says, "Anyone object to this chart?" Anyone object to this chart? Well, let's take a look at the chart here, okay? It says climate history over 9,500 years. So basically what he's trying to point here is that, look, there's all these rapid fluctuations and, where we are right now is below the average mean and everything. Then if you look at the graph, as they point out here, and this is one thing I'll give credit to maybe Elon Musk or Twitter for generally here, is this note feature, because they basically just allow you to fact check people in real time. The graph that he posted only shows data through 1885. Okay, so in other words, before the massive influx of CO2 and other climate worsening emissions over the last century or so, okay, just stopped the graph at 1885, as if that's where we ended the conversation. Okay, at this point, 1885 and onwards is when it skyrockets. All right, so that's the kind of person that Jordan B. Peterson is, right? A supposed doctor who is unable to look at a simple graph like this and recognize its limitations. I mean, it's genuinely embarrassing, and it's not only embarrassing, but again, it shows you how he's not operating in good faith, right? Because there's no way that you could possibly overlook that. Now, I want to just finish off here with this clip that was pointed out here by the Rational National. This is back from a year ago, with Jordan Peterson, went on Joe Rogan and was basically, insinuating we can't possibly address climate change because it's just too complicated. There's so many things, there's so many different definitions of climate change, and how are we possibly going to come to an agreement on this? And there's no real way to actually tackle the issue. So let's remind ourselves of what Peterson thinks about this issue here.
Climate change one is a weird one. So
that's because there's no such thing as climate, right? Climate and everything are the same word. And that's what bothers me about the climate change types. It's like, this is something that bothers me about it technically. It's like, well, climate is about everything. So, okay, but your models aren't based on everything. Your models are based on
warming.
a set number of variables.
Yeah.
So that means you've reduced the variables, which are everything, to that set. Well, how did you decide which set of variables to include in the equation if it's about everything? And that's not just a criticism. That's like, if it's about everything, your models aren't right. Because your models do not and cannot model everything.
This is what the podcast.
Okay. I mean, I 100% sympathize with the face that David was making at the end of this clip here. I mean, like, how do you even react to that? I mean, what is he saying? Climate change is everything. Okay, hold on. Nobody said climate change is everything. We have a set variables that we're talking about that scientists are referring to when we talk about climate change, the potential effects of these greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, it's very simple what we're talking. I mean, it's not simple, but it's understandable exactly what variables we're talking about here and what the consequences are going to be if we stay on the current trajectory. But Jordan's analysis, okay, this big brain genius of the right, okay, this intellectual giant is coming forward and basically just saying, well, climate change means everything, and therefore, since your variables don't include everything and you can't specifically model every single last molecule that exists on the face of the planet right now and every single detail about how the world and society function, then you can't possibly map out what the consequences of climate change are going to be. I mean, it's an absolute fucking joke. Okay, so obviously I'm going to come down and, believe it or not, side with Marianne Williamson in this back and forth. And again, this is just a reminder in terms of how shamelessly pathetic people like Jordan Peterson are, especially when it comes to issues that he obviously has some sort of either a misunderstanding on or a conflict of interest on. And again, you know, Marianne Williamson, she's somebody who seems to be genuinely acting in good faith and wants to tackle these issues in a serious way. And that is exactly why people like Jordan Peterson and also people within the media, the liberal media included in that, and the Democratic Party establishment as well, are trying to smear her and shut her campaign down.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying